Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today, it stems from a pretty high-level roundtable discussion that was dissecting the perceived domestic threat posed by certain radical left-wing movements. The source material we're looking at is full of claims of organized violence, very deliberate attacks on federal law enforcement and journalists, and also the presence of, frankly, complex, sophisticated funding networks that seem to support this behavior. So the central question, the critical question we really have to get into is this. Does the evidence presented, and it details targeted violence, interstate coordination, deep funding, does all that necessitate and justify designating Antifa as a formal domestic terrorist organization? My position is that the systemic nature of the violence and the clear evidence of what looks like an organized structure demands this designation. We need it to unlock and deploy the full, comprehensive legal and investigative powers of the federal government, powers that just aren't available through standard criminal proceedings.
Right, and I think I come at it from a slightly different angle. Well, look, nobody denies the criminal and violent nature of the acts detailed in the material. They are, as you said, undeniably horrific. I really question the practical utility and maybe even the legal applicability of applying a formal terrorist organization designation here. And this concern actually stems directly from how the movement is described in the material itself, as intentionally decentralized and autonomous. That distinction, I think, is crucial. We have to separate robust prosecution of, actual criminal conspiracies from the, let's say, the political and legal burden of applying this broad counterterrorism framework to what might be better understood as a fluid, non-hierarchical ideology.
But the threat level described, it seems to demand a designation that goes beyond standard criminal behavior. The material doesn't just characterize the movement as, simple activism gone wrong. It uses terms like anarchy and domestic left-wing terror. And look at the specific examples of politically motivated violence. The sniper attack on the Dallas ICE facility that killed 2 people, leaving a note explicitly intended to inflict real terror. The storming of the Texas ICE facility where an officer was shot in the neck after dozens of rounds were fired. And then you have the repeated, months-long sieges of federal property in Portland. The targets are clearly ideological. Federal law enforcement, like ICE, and journalists who dare to expose their actions. People like Andy No, left with a subarachnoid hemorrhage, or Katie Daviscourt, who was struck in the face with a flagpole.
The movement's objective, based on testimony in the material, is explicitly stated as to destroy the American people and our way of life. So, logically, if the goal is political terror and systemic destruction, doesn't the government need to be empowered to treat it like it treats, say, foreign threats or highly structured criminal groups like MS-13, ISIS, or Hamas?
That's a powerful rundown of the severity, absolutely. But let me offer a different perspective on the legal strategy that's required. We acknowledge the horrific criminal acts, definitely, but we still have to grapple with this fundamental definitional problem that's presented in the material itself. The movement is repeatedly described as decentralized autonomous. The difficulty then lies in the fact that it seems to lack that traditional centralized hierarchy, the national headquarters, the registered LLC, the official membership cards, that the federal government usually targets when it uses a designation designed to dismantle an organized entity, sort of brick by brick. So my argument is really about efficacy. We have incredibly powerful legal tools already. RICO statutes, Title 18 conspiracy laws, prosecuting interstate travel for violent acts. These allow us to go after individuals and the specific conspiracies they engage in. Applying the formal designation here, it risks diluting the very meaning of terrorist organization if it can't clearly attach to a coherent structure. And that could lead to protracted legal battles that actually bog down enforcement rather than simplifying it.
See, I challenge that premise, the idea that this movement is so diffuse it cannot be treated as an organization under federal designation standards. The notion that this is merely a diffuse ideology, I think it ignores the evidence of sophistication and coordination that really came out in the source material. The FBI, they don't need a registered LLC to find an organized network. What they need is evidence of conspiracy, payment, coordination. And we heard testimony about the use of paid anarchists, the deployment of expensive uniform signs that require pretty sophisticated logistics and printing. That's a far cry from simple, spontaneous street protest. We heard explicit reference to sophisticated networks, and the strategy outlined by the FBI in the material, following the money, because as they said, money never lies, that's designed precisely to map out these organized criminal thugs. Furthermore, the arrest of a founder's girlfriend in Portland was specifically cited as a strategic move, quote, to get more and more information about the network. This methodology, mapping networks, following funds, targeting key nodes, that's exactly what a designation empowers federal agencies to do with priority and scale, treating it as a strategic national threat, not just a collection of disparate crimes.
Okay, that's an interesting point about the sophistication, and I absolutely agree that coordination exists. The conspiracy to commit violence seems obvious in places, and the use of centralized tech, like those ice block apps that Apple and Google were asked to take down, that certainly proves planning. But I would frame this differently. Coordination and conspiracy, while serious, aren't necessarily the same thing as a unified organizational hierarchy that's susceptible to a systematic counterterrorism designation. When you designate, say, MS-13 or ISIS, you're identifying a leadership structure, a command and control system, recruitment pipelines that can be systematically dismantled. If the structure is truly autonomous, as officials quoted in the material suggested, well, how do you successfully destroy the entire organization from top to bottom, like the goal stated for dealing with cartels? The designation becomes difficult to apply effectively when the threat is defined, at least partly, as this widely accepted fluid ideology, often quoted as being, just an idea. We have to acknowledge the specific challenge raised by the material itself. That lack of a clear legal attachment point makes a designation feel like a blunt instrument, one that might actually be less effective than precise criminal conspiracy charges.
Okay, then let's pivot directly to the financial infrastructure, because the scale and the nature of the funding, I think, are organizational in nature and demand the specific enhanced powers that come with a terrorist designation. You mentioned the power of existing criminal statutes like money laundering, but, those generally require proving the money was derived from illegal activities or was used to conceal those activities. The terrorist designation is crucial precisely because it allows federal agencies, particularly Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, and related entities, to target assets based on executive orders related to terrorism, regardless of whether the funding itself originated from crime. And the material gave us specific monetary facts, more than $100 million flowing from influential, established networks like Soros, Arabella, and Tides, a network that was pretty accurately dubbed Riot Inc.
Right, and that volume of money identified as over $100 million flowing into dozens of radical organizations it's staggering. We absolutely must target that protest industrial complex. But let's just clarify the legal leverage here. I'm sorry, but I'm just not convinced that the terrorist designation is the necessary legal tool to freeze the assets of the funders. If these networks are channeling money to groups that are engaging in conspiracy to commit federal crimes, like destroying federal property or interstate travel for violence, then robust criminal investigations can use existing Title 18 statutes and civil asset forfeiture rules to attack those funds. We don't necessarily need to define the entity as a terrorist organization to follow the money, especially since the source material explicitly identified allegations that Antifa benefits from American tax dollars through the, quote, homeless and housing nonprofit sector. That specific angle seems ripe for financial fraud and compliance investigation under Treasury rules right now, without getting into the contentious designation debate.
Well, I disagree fundamentally on the effectiveness of those existing tools against this specific type of political funding. The challenge isn't prosecuting the low-level rioter on the street. It's getting at the wealthy funders who operate through layers and layers of legal nonprofits and foundations. If you use standard money laundering statutes, you have a really high burden of proof. You have to connect the clean money funnel directly to the specific criminal act committed by the street operative. A terrorist designation, however, it allows the executive branch to target the financial arteries of the entire network, the Arabellas and Tides, for instance, by labeling them as providing material support or operating in connection with designated terror activities. It elevates the priority for intelligence gathering and allows Treasury to freeze assets globally, effectively, suffocating the network.
That's the difference between just prosecuting individuals for fraud and actually dismantling a massive, systemic political funding operation.
But doesn't this introduce the very constitutional ambiguity we probably want to avoid? Designating a decentralized ideological movement could allow the federal government to target legal advocacy groups and major political donors based primarily on an ideological connection to the violence, rather than a proven criminal financial link. The risk seems high that such a designation would be successfully challenged in court, precisely because the legal threshold for targeting funding based on providing material support to an amorphous idea is extremely difficult to meet. It seems far safer, legally and constitutionally, to dedicate federal resources to proving the criminal conspiracy to commit violence, which the material shows ample evidence of, and then use the existing constitutionally sound financial statutes to seize assets, rather than relying on a potentially contested designation to do the heavy lifting.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, primarily because the critical factor demanding federal designation, in my view, is the alleged failure and, in some cases, the complicity of local authorities. This isn't just a national security problem, it's become a jurisdictional crisis. The material is frankly rife with examples of local government failures. Portland police reportedly refusing to detain an assailant who attacked the journalist, even after being held for 35 minutes. Officers allegedly cheering on rioters who were actively threatening the lives of ICE agents. City officials allegedly covering up the terrorism. When local jurisdiction seems to abandon its duty or is allegedly hostile to federal law enforcement, the designation becomes a vital mechanism. It grants the full might of the federal law enforcement, the DEA, FBI, Marshals, ATF, the clear mandate to act decisively on federal charges, essentially superseding local political resistance and ensuring federal property and personnel are protected under the most rigorous national security laws available.
Okay, that's a compelling argument regarding local government failure. And yes, the source material provides some pretty damning evidence of specific instances. Officers ignoring calls for help or appearing to facilitate the escape of suspects. But have you considered the risk of federal overreach here, and maybe the tactical misuse of a counterterrorism framework to solve what is, at its core, perhaps a law enforcement jurisdictional failure? If the primary issue is local police turning a blind eye or refusing to prosecute, isn't the solution more targeted federal intervention against those specific failures? For instance, the material mentions the initiation of pattern and practice investigations into departments like the Portland Police Bureau. That's a powerful federal tool specifically designed for correcting systemic misconduct and restoring local compliance.
But relying solely on pattern and practice investigations feels reactive and slow. The violence described was happening then, urgently. If local officials are, as alleged, covering up the terrorism, a designation shifts the entire legal priority of the violence itself. It moves it from being just a local riot issue, where local prosecutors have discretion, maybe political pressure to drop charges, to a national counterterrorism priority managed by the Department of Justice's National Security Division. This designation provides federal law enforcement agents with enhanced intelligence gathering tools, potentially higher sentencing guidelines, and the absolute mandate to enforce federal laws, like those against flag burning, if it's used to incite violence, in situations where local politics might otherwise intervene. We surely can't allow ideological violence to flourish simply because some local leadership refuses to cooperate. The designation, I argue, is the required legal hammer to force federal intervention against what appears to be a systematic, politically motivated threat that local governance has, allegedly, failed to address.
I suppose I challenge the idea that this is the only viable hammer. We have seen success in dismantling other organized crime operations through federal task forces, through RICO charges, through Joint Terrorism Task Forces, JTTFs, that specifically combine federal and local resources. The strategic challenge we face, I think, is balancing the urgent need to address these violent political acts with the intellectual and legal rigor required for a formal terrorist designation. If we apply the terrorist label to what is fundamentally described as a decentralized network of conspirators, we risk both diluting the gravity of that term and facing almost inevitable legal challenges based on the very vagueness of the entity being designated. So I maintain that targeted federal prosecution of criminal conspiracies, combined with vigorous pursuit of financial crimes, remains the most powerful, legally sound, and arguably effective strategy for dismantling this threat without incurring the constitutional risk associated with designating a non-hierarchical idea. So, just to summarize my perspective, while the level of targeted, politically motivated violence described against federal agents and journalists is horrific, and it absolutely demands robust federal action, the strategic debate for me has to focus on utility. The inherent decentralized, autonomous nature of the movement, as described, presents a significant, perhaps insurmountable challenge to the effectiveness and legal stability of labeling it a singular terrorist organization. Federal law enforcement should instead double down on targeted prosecution of the actual criminal conspiracies and relentlessly pursue the financial networks, that so-called Riot Inc., using the existing powerful statutes like RICO and money laundering laws, which are tailored to follow criminal money regardless of the group's ideological structure.
And my position remains firm that the severity of the targeted, politically motivated violence, combined with clear evidence of large-scale funding and coordinated operation that spans state lines and includes these serious allegations of widespread local complicity, validates the terrorist designation. This designation isn't just rhetoric, it's a necessary legal key. It's required to grant federal agencies the maximum resources, priority, and legal standing to dismantle the entirety of the threat, including its funding apparatus, especially where local governance appears to have failed. The material clearly illuminates the deep national challenge we face in addressing violence emanating from these amorphous, autonomous, yet heavily funded groups. Whether this is ultimately defined legally as a criminal conspiracy or a domestic terrorist organization, the source material compels us to acknowledge that it is a systemic threat requiring the most aggressive and integrated federal response possible.